in the soft glow of candlelight. Long before the hum of electricity or the buzz of the internet, people whispered stories to one another. Stories not of heroes, but of cruelty. While knights galloped across muddy battlefields and kings plotted in dimly lit chambers, another kind of history was quietly taking shape. It was the story of those whose names echoed not for their kindness or bravery, but for how far they went to get what they wanted. Power, revenge, fear. In the medieval world, cruelty wasn't always hidden in the shadows. Sometimes it wore a crown, or sat behind a judge's bench, or led soldiers with a cold, unblinking gaze. These weren't the kinds of people whose stories you'd find in gentle bedtime tales. But tonight, you will hear them. This is boring history for sleep, quiet, slow, and easy on the mind. Yet within are names that once made entire cities tremble. Not every figure from the Middle Ages was cruel, of course. Many were just surviving, farming, or praying. But a few left behind a legacy written in fear. They lived in a world where the line between justice and vengeance blurred easily, where cruelty wasn't always punished. It was sometimes rewarded. And in that world, these people thrived. Our story begins not with a scream, but with silence. A silence that settled over a castle's stone walls after nightfall, broken only by the wind rustling through blackened trees. In the stillness, a figure moved, a man with eyes that seemed to hold no soul. He was not a peasant nor a priest, but something worse. He had once been trusted, even respected, but something in him had changed. Or perhaps it had always been there. People whispered his name only behind closed doors, too afraid to speak it aloud. He had ordered men to be flayed alive, had laughed as fires consumed his enemies. Some said he had no heart. Others said he had once been kind, but had been broken by betrayal. No one really knew. This is not the story of one man, though. It's the story of many. Across Europe, from windswept Scottish castles to Italian fortresses that clung to rocky cliffs, cruel rulers left their marks not just in war, but in everyday life. Some were queens who used poison as their weapon. Others were inquisitors, dressed in robes, who claimed to be hunting heresy but enjoyed the suffering too much. And then there were those whose cruelty didn't come from madness or power, but from a cold, calculated belief that fear was the only way to rule. To understand how such cruelty could thrive, we must step back into their world. A world with no police, no cameras, no human rights. A world where justice often came at the end of a sword, and mercy was a rare luxury. Children were raised hearing tales of executions, watching them in public squares. Some would grow to fear what they saw. Others would grow to enjoy it. In one village, tucked deep within the hills of what is now modern France, a woman ruled with a hand so firm. Her name was forbidden in prayers. She wasn't royalty, just a noble woman with a bitter past. She had lost her child to illness, her husband to war, and her soul to the ache of control. She punished servants with icy calm, not out of rage, but to remind them who held the power. Her cruelty wasn't loud or wild, it was measured, and in many ways, that made it worse. In Italy, a nobleman known for his charm and wit held glittering banquets that dazzled guests. But behind the laughter and music, there was a darker tale. He kept prisoners in his dungeons not for justice, but for sport. He would walk among them like a farmer inspecting livestock, choosing one to torment each week. To the world above, he was a poet and a gentleman. But in truth, he was something far colder. The masks of politeness and cruelty often fit the same face in medieval courts. Further north, in what is now Germany, a bishop carried both a cross and a whip. He claimed to serve God, but his punishments were brutal. He ruled not just the souls of his people, but their bodies. His sermons were filled with fire and fury, and his punishments left no room for grace. Those who questioned him were branded as heretics, locked away, or burned at the stake. He believed he was saving their souls. Others believed he simply liked the control. But cruelty in the Middle Ages wasn't always found in the powerful. Sometimes it lived among the forgotten. A soldier, left behind after a siege, took control of a ruined town and became its judge, jailer, and executioner. He created his own twisted laws. His cruelty wasn't strategic, it was wild. His punishments changed with his moods, and the people learned to live in silence, hoping not to be noticed. No one knew how many he had killed. They only knew that if you heard footsteps at night, you didn't open your door. And then, there was the woman whose beauty was said to match her cruelty. She was young, clever, and born into wealth. But instead of using it to help others, she created her own version of justice. Her servants were terrified of her. Her enemies disappeared quietly, and her home became known not for its luxury, but for its silence. People said she bathed in the blood of the innocent. Whether true or not, the whispers were enough to stain her name forever. All of these stories exist in the murky space between truth and legend. The records are incomplete, the witnesses long gone, the truth buried beneath centuries of dirt and fear. But the stories remain, passed down not in books, but in warning. They remind us of what can happen when cruelty is allowed to grow unchecked, when fear becomes a language, when power becomes a mirror for pain. Even today, historians debate the details. Some say these people were misunderstood. Others say the records were too kind. But what's clear is that in a world built on survival, cruelty was sometimes the fastest way to rise and the slowest way to fall. As the night deepens, the candles burn lower. Outside, a crow lands on a crumbling stone wall, its eyes scanning the darkness. The stories you'll hear next will take you deeper into this forgotten world, into hidden chambers and ruined halls, into minds that saw kindness as weakness and cruelty as strength. But for now, we rest on the edge. The worst is yet to come. One name has not yet been spoken. One figure remains in the shadows, more feared than all the others. Their cruelty was not only ruthless, but clever, a name so soaked in fear that even kings shuddered to speak it aloud. Who were they? What did they do? She was known only by a single name, one that echoed through the narrow streets of a once bustling city now swallowed by time. The villagers called her the widow, though no one remembered her husband or how he had died. Some said she had poisoned him slowly, over many nights, with a powder ground so fine it disappeared into his wine. Others claimed he had simply vanished, the way many things did around her. The truth was buried with the rest of her secrets, tucked beneath the soil that no one dared to dig. But her presence was real, heavy, unshakable. When she passed through the village square, children ran and doors shut without a word. And though she was never seen with a weapon, people said her eyes were sharper than any blade. The widow ruled her household like a queen without a court. Servants came and went like shadows, rarely staying long. One girl who left in the night returned weeks later, broken and mute. Her eyes never met another's again. No one asked her what she'd seen. No one wanted to know. And yet, oddly enough, the widow was never accused of crime. She gave alms at church, smiled at the bishop, and offered sweet biscuits to the poor, biscuits no one dared eat. This strange blend of politeness and menace was a common thread among cruel people of the Middle Ages. They rarely stormed into a room with raised swords. Instead, their cruelty moved quietly, under cloaks behind smiles, and through laws that sounded fair but held sharp teeth. They didn't need dungeons filled with screams. All they needed was fear and the ability to make others believe that fear was the only safe choice. In another forgotten town, this one tucked between gray mountains where winter seemed to never end, there lived a man who called himself a healer. He had knowledge of herbs, potions, and bone setting. People came to him with broken limbs and desperate prayers. At first, he helped. A boy's fever cooled under his care. An old woman's twisted hand found relief. But over time, his interest shifted. Healing turned into testing. Curiosity darkened into control. He began taking in patients who weren't sick, only scared. He convinced them they were cursed, then offered remedies only he could provide. If they resisted, he called them liars. If they cried, he said it was proof they were possessed. Soon, the townspeople stopped questioning him. They feared that even doubting his word could bring illness, or worse. He built his reputation on quiet torment, wearing the title of healer like armor. And though his house was filled with drying herbs and books of prayer, it reeked of something darker. The truth about what he did in his cellar was never recorded, but some say the screams from below were softer than sobs, like those of people who had already accepted their fate. Not all cruelty came in whispers, though. There were those who ruled openly with iron fists and cold hearts. One such figure was a duke from a northern kingdom where the snow never fully melted. He wore furs dyed red with the blood of wolves. He hunted for sport, not for food. His castle sat high on a hill, watching over the villages below like a vulture over a battlefield. The villagers paid their taxes with shaking hands, knowing that being short even a single coin might earn them a visit from the duke's soldiers. He kept a hall of punishments, his words, not theirs. In it, he displayed the tools he had used to teach lessons to those who disobeyed. No one knew how many had died in that hall, but the walls were stained, and the stone never quite lost the smell of smoke and iron. The duke didn't hide his cruelty. He wore it proudly, like a title, and those under his rule learned quickly submission was survival. But cruelty didn't always come from the powerful. Sometimes it grew in the minds of the overlooked. A monk, quiet and humble, copied sacred texts by candlelight. He prayed 3 times a day, kept his vows, and never raised his voice. But in his solitude, something strange began to fester. He believed he had been chosen, not by his fellow monks, but by God himself, to punish the impure. He began writing secret pages, filled with twisted commandments and harsh penance. When a young novice made a mistake in his copying, the monk whipped him in silence, then told him to pray harder. He believed he was cleansing sin, not causing harm. And so, his cruelty grew under the belief that it was holy. The abbey became a cold place, filled with forced smiles and bruises hidden under robes. The monk's gaze was soft, his words slow, but the fear he created ran deep. And when he finally disappeared into the forest one winter night, no one searched for him. Not even the abbot. Even in cities where the law was strong and guards patrolled the streets, cruelty found clever ways to hide. One judge, known for his sharp mind and fair rulings, held a secret ledger in his private chambers. In it, he listed those who had wronged him, even slightly. A merchant who argued over a tax. A servant who spilled wine. A woman who laughed at him behind his back. He waited months, even years, before exacting his revenge. But always came. A harsh sentence. A sudden tax audit. A missing child. He made sure that no one could trace it back to him, and those who tried found themselves cornered by rules they didn't understand. He wore justice like a mask, but underneath was a heart twisted by pride. The cruelest thing about him wasn't his power, it was how calmly he used it. These stories, though heavy, are softened here with slow words and quiet pacing, perfect for resting minds. History often paints a world of knights and dragons, but it also hides darker corners where kindness didn't survive. In those corners, people used fear like currency. Some were driven by pain, others by belief. A few simply enjoyed watching others suffer. But among them all, one name still lingers in the distance, unspoken and unexplored. A figure whose cruelty eclipsed the rest. One who didn't need an army or a castle to leave a mark. They needed only time and patience. And now, the path of their story slowly opens ahead. Just beyond this moment, just beyond this breath, where the candles flicker low and sleep begins to settle in. You're almost ready to meet them, but not yet. First, let the stillness deepen. Let the story hold you. There are more names, more forgotten cruelties, waiting quietly in the folds of time. And we'll return to them one by one. Soon, in a narrow village where the hills rolled low and fog clung to the ground like a second skin, there lived a man named Edric. His name doesn't appear in great medieval chronicles. He was not a noble, not a priest, not even a soldier. He was a gatekeeper, just a man who opened and closed the wooden fence that separated the town from the forest. But Edric, in his quiet way, had become feared by everyone who lived there. not because of what he said or did in daylight, but because of what happened when he decided someone wasn't fit to belong anymore. No one could prove that he ever hurt anyone. No one ever caught him in the act. But when Edric turned cold toward a family, misfortune always followed. A fire might burn their barn. A sickness would strike their child. Their chickens would vanish one by one. People whispered about it behind their shutters, always after dark. It was as if Edric had made a deal with the forest, that the trees obeyed him, that the wind bent to his wishes. Of course, these are just stories. Probably. But it didn't stop anyone from giving him whatever he wanted, no matter how small. And over time, he learned to expect it. That's how cruelty worked in people like Edric. It wasn't always loud or bloody. Sometimes, it just twisted quietly around small choices, around silence and fear and the knowledge that everyone else would look away. Far from Edric's forested home, across a wide stretch of farmland and ruined Roman roads, a different kind of cruelty took root. In a stone manor surrounded by steep cliffs and crashing sea, a baron ruled with absolute control over a handful of nearby fishing villages. His name was Lord Halwyn, and his eyes were always calculating. He wasn't particularly strong or violent, but he was clever. He understood people, and he understood pain, not just how to inflict it, but how to time it. When one village failed to meet his tax demands, he didn't send soldiers. He sent a letter, and then he waited. The people tried harder. They worked until their hands bled. But when the payment came up short again, he selected one man at random, a fisherman with 4 children, and took him in the night. No trial, no warning, just gone. The next morning, a wooden mask was nailed to the village church, painted with red streaks. No one spoke a word about it, but from then on, every coin was paid on time. Lord Halwyn rarely raised his voice. He never carried a sword, but people feared him more than bandits or wolves. That's another way cruelty worked in the medieval world. It made people believe they had no choice, that cruelty was part of life, like rain or hunger. Some even believed it came from God, that suffering made them holy. And for those who thrived on causing pain, this belief made it all the easier to justify. In one remote monastery, high in the snowy peaks of what is now Switzerland, a strict order of monks lived in almost total silence. Their vows forbade speech except during prayer. Among them was Brother Adalric, a tall, gaunt man who kept the rules like iron. He believed that sin lived in comfort, and that the body must suffer to free the soul. So he made life as harsh as possible, not just for himself, but for others. He ordered cold baths, even in winter. He removed doors from sleeping quarters so the wind could teach humility. When a young novice accidentally dropped a candle during morning prayers, Adalric demanded he kneel outside in the snow for 6 hours. The boy's feet were ruined, and he never walked properly again. But Adalric never flinched. To him, mercy was weakness. His cruelty didn't come from rage or hatred. It came from conviction. That's what made it so frightening. Sometimes, the cruelest people believed they were doing good. And sometimes, they didn't care at all. There was a duchess, known in her time as Lady Isabella, who ruled over a fertile valley known for its wool trade. Her land was wealthy, her people hardworking, but Isabella had a hunger for control that went far beyond taxes or land. She had grown up in a court where manipulation was survival, and she had learned that kindness earned nothing. So she ruled with precision. Her punishments were never emotional, they were measured. If a farmer underweighed his wool, she cut off a finger. If a woman was caught gossiping, her tongue was pierced with iron. Yet what made her stand out wasn't the severity of her rule. It was her poise. She hosted poets and scholars, smiled in portraits, and held charity feasts for the church. Outsiders thought her gracious, elegant, but her people lived in quiet dread. Every glance, every word could be misread. One misplaced compliment, and a servant might disappear. No one knew exactly how many had died under her rule, but the silence in her halls said enough. And still, she was praised in official records. Because cruelty, especially when hidden beneath civility, was often overlooked by those not directly touched by it. As long as the taxes were paid and the streets stayed quiet, No one questioned the methods. Even in times of war, when brutality was expected, some stood out for just how far they went. One knight, known only by his war name, the Red Fist, was feared on both sides of every battle. He was not loyal to any king, but hired out his services to whoever paid most. His armor was always clean, polished, and marked with no crest. Yet his enemies recognized him instantly, because when he fought, he made sure his victims remembered. He left survivors not by accident, but by design, so they would spread tales of what he did. He never smiled. He never shouted. He just did his job with mechanical cruelty and then moved on. Some said he had no soul. Others said he had once loved someone and lost her and never forgave the world. But no one ever dared ask. By the time he vanished from the pages of history, he had outlived 3 kings and burned more villages than anyone could count. His final resting place is unknown, but even now, local legends say if you walk alone near old battlefields, you might hear the sound of metal tapping against stone, his footsteps still searching. As the candles flicker lower and your eyes begin to close, the story doesn't end. It only slows, because there is still one name we haven't spoken, a name buried deeper than the rest, a figure so cruel, so infamous, that their legend was nearly erased from the records out of shame. They were not a queen, or a bishop, or a knight. They were something in between, a shadow in plain sight. And soon, you'll meet them. Not yet, not now, but very soon. For now, rest. Let the hush of history lull you further into stillness. Let the names fade into mist. The cruelest of them all is waiting. But not tonight. Tonight, the past is quiet. The cold stone halls are still, and the cruel watch in silence. Down in the lowlands, where the rivers carved gentle paths through farmland and meadows, there once stood a small village with a name now lost to time. The buildings were simple, timber, thatch, and stone, and the people were poor but proud. They worked hard and lived quiet lives, the kind where nothing much happened for years. But even the most peaceful place can fall under a shadow when cruelty finds its way in. In this case, it wasn't an outsider who brought the fear. It was someone who had grown up among them. A boy who used to chase chickens barefoot through muddy streets, who laughed with other children and helped his mother carry water from the well. His name was Tomas. No title, no grand family, just Tomas. But as he grew, something changed. At first, it was small things. A pet bird found crushed behind stable. A neighbor's goat gone missing. A girl who tripped near him and swore she'd been pushed. Most people dismissed it. Boys will be boys, they said. Childhood mischief. But those who looked closely noticed the way Tomas watched others. Not with curiosity, but with calculation. Like he was learning something no one else could see. By the time he was a young man, Tomas had learned how to smile, just enough to disarm suspicion. He knew how to say the right things to the elders, how to play helpful when it suited him. But behind closed doors, those closest to him began to vanish. First his uncle, who had once scolded him in front of others. Then a neighbor who accused him of stealing grain. Their disappearances were explained away. One went traveling, the other drowned in the river. No bodies were ever found. But no one looked too hard, because something in Tomas' eyes warned them not to. He never raised his voice. He never carried a weapon. But slowly, people began treating him with quiet caution. They avoided crossing him, gave him what he wanted. The cruelty he wielded wasn't loud. It was patient, precise, and deeply personal. In that same era, far across the continent, in a windswept Baltic region, there existed a fortress on a cliffside. Cold, gray, and wrapped in fog for much of the year, it was home to a military commander named Roderick the Iron. He had earned his nickname not from the armor he wore, but from the way he ruled. Roderick believed that discipline was the highest virtue, and anything that disrupted order was an offense that deserved punishment. To his men, he was fair in a brutal kind of way. But to the local population, he was a curse. He taxed not only money, but movement, charging farmers to cross roads, to use wells, even to sing in public. When people couldn't pay, he punished them with a chilling sense of calm. A man caught stealing bread had his hand broken, then sent back to his family with a note. A second chance is a mistake I won't make. A girl who insulted him from a crowd was made to stand barefoot on ice until she collapsed. Roderick never saw himself as cruel. He saw himself as necessary. And that's what made his rule so terrifying. He believed in it. He believed that mercy weakened the spine, that kindness encouraged rebellion. And so, his world was kept frozen in place, both by weather and by fear. But cruelty wasn't always physical. Some knew how to break the spirit without touching the skin. One such figure lived in a noble estate deep in Bohemia. Her name was Lady Marta, and she was known as the Whisperer by her servants. Not because she spoke softly, but because her power came from words. Marta could destroy a person with a single sentence. She knew every rumor, every secret, every hidden shame in her court, and she used them like tools. She didn't need to lift a finger to punish. She just needed to speak the right words into the right ears. A maid who annoyed her found herself accused of theft. A rival lady's marriage was quietly ruined by whispered lies. Even visiting nobles tread lightly in her halls, afraid of ending up on the wrong side of her tongue. What made Marta especially frightening was how charming she could be. Visitors left her estate praising her wit, her taste, her grace. Only later did they realize what they'd given up. Information favors leverage. She collected these things like trophies, and no one ever caught her in a lie, because she didn't need to lie. She simply used the truth in ways others never would. Cruelty like hers didn't leave scars on the skin, but it hollowed people out just the same. Then there were those whose cruelty was hidden behind causes. In one corner of medieval Spain, during a time of fierce religious tension, a man named Father Osvaldo led a small community with what he called righteous fire. He was not officially tied to the Inquisition, but he acted with the same authority. To him, suspicion was guilt, and guilt meant punishment. He encouraged neighbors to report one another for sins as small as skipping Mass or speaking kindly to those of other faiths. People lived in fear of being accused, because once accused, there was no return. Osvaldo didn't torture. He didn't need to. He shamed. He isolated. He stripped people of their names in the community, made them invisible, untouchable. A mother accused of impurity could lose her children, her home, her friends, all without a single mark on her body. The weight of his cruelty was heavy because it was invisible to outsiders. He prayed loudly, preached with passion, wrote letters to higher clergy full of praise for his flock. But within his walls, people were terrified to speak, to breathe, because in his eyes, God was watching, and God, apparently, was cruel. There's something haunting about this kind of history, because the most brutal people weren't always the ones we expect. They didn't always wear black robes or wave bloody swords. Sometimes they were soft-spoken, well-dressed, respected. Sometimes they were neighbors, and sometimes they were family. And yet, all of this, the poisoners, the schemers, the merciless lords, still pales in comparison to the figure whose name remains locked in the final chapters of this tale. The cruelest of them all, the one whose story was so disturbing it was nearly erased, whose records were hidden in monasteries, whose name was struck from noble rolls, who wielded pain with such precision, even hardened warriors avoided speaking of them. They didn't need an army. They didn't build an empire. But what they did left behind a silence that stretched through centuries. Soon, you'll hear their story. But not just yet. The candles grow lower. The wind softens against the stones. The night folds in on itself, inviting quiet. Rest in this silence, with the shadows of history gently drifting around you. Let sleep draw near, and know that the cruelest tale of all still waits, just ahead. Long before their name was erased, before the fires and the missing pages, they lived in a stone house perched on the edge of a cliff. The sea below roared endlessly, waves crashing into the black rocks, as if trying to warn the world. Locals avoided the place, not because of curses or ghost stories, but because of something they couldn't explain. A coldness, perhaps, or maybe a silence too deep to feel natural. The house itself wasn't grand, just a long, narrow structure with gray walls and thick wooden doors. But the person who lived inside it had become something more than flesh and blood. They had become a story, a warning, a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Their name has been lost, but the fragments remain, hidden in records scattered across old monasteries and crumbling libraries. A letter from a monk in the north speaks of a noble patron whose generosity came with a chill. A merchant's diary references a woman with gray eyes like winter fog and a voice so steady it silenced a room. Another entry, more frantic, is barely legible. She knew. She knew before I said anything. Each document, while vague, speaks of someone powerful, calculating, and impossible to forget. This figure, this forgotten shadow, rose not through war or politics, but through patience. They understood people better than anyone else around them, knew what they wanted, what they feared, what they do to protect themselves. And once they knew that, they had control, not just over servants or soldiers, but over entire communities, over thoughts, over choices, over silence. Their cruelty wasn't explosive. It unfolded slowly, a whisper planted in the right ear, a favor granted with invisible strings, an enemy left untouched, not forgiven but watched. And when the moment came, when the trap quietly closed, no one ever saw it coming. The true fear didn't come from what they did. It came from not knowing what they might do. In one of the oldest village records from that region, a midwife describes visiting the stone house. She had been summoned to tend to a sick servant. When she arrived, everything was neat. Too neat. The walls were bare. The halls smelled faintly of iron and herbs. The servant, a girl no older than 15, wouldn't speak. She only looked at the midwife with wide eyes, as if begging for something she couldn't say. The mistress of the house thanked the midwife in perfect form, soft voice, graceful manners, payment in full. But the midwife never returned. She didn't talk about what she saw, only packed her belongings the next morning and moved 3 villages away. It was this kind of quiet tension that followed the figure everywhere. People never saw a crime. They never heard screams. But they left, slowly, then faster. Families moved. Travelers changed their paths. One priest, sent to deliver a yearly blessing, wrote a note to his bishop afterward. It simply said, "The air is wrong there. Please don't send me again." Despite the fear, despite the rumors, this person continued to rise. Not in status, but in influence. Disputes between noble families were mysteriously resolved when they got involved. 2 rival landowners, locked in a bitter feud for years, suddenly ended it with no explanation. Both pale, quiet, and unwilling to speak of what changed their minds. A merchant who cheated villagers vanished overnight. His shop was cleaned out, but nothing was stolen. Just gone. No one could say exactly what this person did. That was part of their power. The lack of evidence. The calm. Even the monks who later tried to record her history could only guess at her actions. One described her as the hand that guides the knife, without ever holding it. Another simply called her the void in velvet. They feared her, but they also admired her precision, her patience, her refusal to be ruled by emotion. As she grew older, her methods grew colder, more refined. She no longer needed to involve herself directly. Others did her work, willingly or without knowing. A nod here, a suggestion there. Fear spread not from violence, but from possibility. What happened if you crossed her? No one knew. And that was the worst part. That unspoken weight. That endless question. There is a story told by a young steward who served her for a brief time. He was warned not to ask questions, not to speak unless spoken to. But one night, after a long silence at dinner, he found the courage to ask, "Do you believe in justice?" She looked at him for a long moment, her spoon resting gently in her bowl. Then she said, "Justice is often another word for revenge. And revenge," she added, "is for those too impatient to let time do the work." He never asked her anything again. Still, even as her influence grew, so did the discomfort around her. Those close to her seemed to fade over time. Her oldest servant, who had been with her since childhood, was said to have walked into the sea one winter morning and never came back. A distant cousin, once considered her heir, wrote a will naming someone else, then died mysteriously in his sleep weeks later. A scholar who tried to publish a book about her connections found every page of his manuscript burned in his study while he was out walking. His neighbors swore no one entered his house. It was as though history itself resisted being written about her. And perhaps that was her greatest triumph. Not in the pain she caused, but in the silence she left behind. Even now, no one knows her real name. Only fragments. Only shadows. As the plot deepens, the air around her story tightens. Because what she represents isn't just cruelty. It's the kind that hides behind grace, the kind that thrives in order, in manners, in quiet decisions made behind closed doors. She reminds us that the cruelest figures in history didn't always shout or conquer or kill. Sometimes they whispered, and the whispers lasted longer than swords ever could. Now, her tale lingers just out of reach. The edge of memory, the boundary of belief. And we're still walking toward it, slowly, carefully, step by step. But we're not there yet. Not quite. Tonight, the wind still howls along the coast where her stone house once stood. The path to her past winds deeper into the dark. And though sleep begins to soften the world around you, her story has only just begun. In the years that followed her disappearance from public life, people began to notice something strange. Not just the absence of her name from official records, but the absence of questions. It was as if the world had agreed, in silent unison, to forget. No monuments were built. No portraits hung in great halls. No songs were sung. And yet, everyone remembered something, even if they couldn't quite say what. Just the mention of a cold woman with gray eyes, and too much influence would be enough to darken a room. The villagers near her estate said the wind near the cliffs changed after she left. It became quieter, more watchful. Children who once ran freely near the woods stopped playing there altogether. They'd return home pale, claiming they'd seen a figure standing far off near the tree line, never moving, never speaking, just watching. Of course, their parents told them it was their imagination. But even the adults began to notice that animals wouldn't go near the old path that led to her house. Horses would stop without being told. Dogs would whimper. Birds never nested on the roof. Inside that house, now empty for years, the furniture remained untouched. Plates still sat neatly stacked on a shelf. A shawl hung over the back of a chair. There was no sign of a struggle, no mess, no blood. Just absence, as though the house had held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. Those who dared step inside never stayed long. They couldn't explain it, but they all left with the same feeling, that they had been noticed. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more delicate, like being studied by a presence that had no need to speak because it already knew everything worth knowing about you. And perhaps that was her greatest cruelty, the way she made people feel like they were never truly alone again. Far away, in abbeys and archives, scribes sometimes came across references to her in old letters, buried beneath layers of dust and ink. A bishop once wrote that she understood men better than the saints did. A merchant warned his son to never bargain with the woman of the cliff, no matter how kind her voice. These notes, scattered and faint, seemed to echo the same sentiment. She had power, not just over people's actions, but over their memories. She didn't need to harm you to change your life. She only needed to enter your mind and stay there. It is said that her final years were spent in silence, not out of guilt or retreat, but by choice. She no longer needed to act. Her work had already rippled through the region. Families who once opposed her influence now carried her lessons forward, teaching their children how to speak without truth, how to smile while withholding, how to make decisions that appeared gentle but cut deeply beneath the surface. Her legacy became a pattern rather than a story, a way of behaving. And because it looked like order, like reason, like dignity, it was almost never questioned. That perhaps was the cruelest trick of all, teaching the world to fear something they couldn't name, something they didn't even realize they had learned. Long after her death, a scholar traveling through the region recorded a strange observation in his journal. He had asked several locals about the old house on the cliff, curious if anyone still remembered the woman who lived there. Most of them shrugged or shook their heads. "That place is empty," one old man said. "Always has been." But later that evening, as the scholar passed the edge of the cliffside alone, he saw a candle flickering in the upper window of the abandoned house. No light source was visible, no movement inside, just that small flame, steady against the dark. It was gone by the time he returned with others. But he never forgot it. When he wrote about it later, he said, "It wasn't just the candle. It was the feeling that I had been expected. That's what she left behind. An atmosphere. A presence." And though the people stopped speaking her name, she continued to exist in the way they moved, the way they looked over their shoulders when making difficult choices. Her methods lived on in others, passed down not as cruelty, but as strategy, as protection, as survival. She taught the world to wear masks not out of deception, but out of control. And even now, in the quiet parts of a night, when the mind softens and dreams begin to flicker like distant torches, her story lingers. Not loud, not screaming, but waiting, always waiting. The cruelest people in medieval history weren't always the ones who caused the most bloodshed. Sometimes, they were the ones who rewrote the rules without telling anyone, who taught others to distrust softness, who turned survival into a quiet performance of strength. And in doing so, they reshaped history not through armies, but through fear wrapped in velvet. As you rest, as your breath slows and your thoughts drift gently, the world she ruled slips further into shadow. Her name remains unsaid. Her footsteps fade, but the memory of what she represented, the kind of cruelty that whispers instead of roars, remains. And as the stars hang still over old battlements and overgrown paths, the silence of history holds its breath once more, wondering if she is truly gone, or merely watching from somewhere just beyond the veil. In the years that followed, the region around the old stone house changed. Villages grew quieter. Fields went untended. The trees near the cliffside crept forward, as if nature itself wanted to bury what remained. And yet, no matter how many seasons passed, people still walked a little faster near the edge of the forest. They still lowered their voices when speaking of the woman who ruled without raising her hand. Her story was never fully told, not in any book, not in any sermon, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The absence of a record was its own kind of message. Her cruelty wasn't meant to be remembered in detail. It was meant to haunt quietly, to become a warning passed through instincts rather than words. One traveler, many years later, spoke of visiting a tavern not far from where her estate once stood. He'd been caught in a storm and took shelter there, hoping for warmth and a dry place to rest. The innkeeper poured him a mug of cider and asked where he'd come from. When the traveler mentioned he'd walked past the cliffs, the tavern fell silent. No one said anything for a long time. Then a woman at the back of the room whispered, "Did you feel her watching?" The traveler laughed, trying to shake off the unease. "The house is empty," he said. "Has been for years." The woman didn't smile. "That doesn't mean she left." It's difficult to explain the kind of cruelty that doesn't show itself directly. In so many stories from the medieval world, we hear of violent rulers, corrupt bishops, and brutal warriors. But the cruelty of this woman, this forgotten figure, was different. It was patient. It allowed others to destroy themselves. It allowed fear to settle in and do the work for her. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply made people believe that disobedience would carry a cost too heavy to bear. And what's worse, it worked. Villages fell into quiet obedience. Families turned inward. Secrets became currency. Even the kindest people began to hide their thoughts. They stopped dreaming out loud. They stopped asking questions. Cruelty, in this form, didn't just harm the body. It reshaped entire communities, rewiring how people thought, how they trusted, how they lived. One old woman, long after the house was abandoned, recalled a story her grandmother had once told. When she was a child, she'd been invited to the stone house to deliver a basket of herbs. She remembered walking through the garden, noting how strangely ordered everything was. Every bush trimmed evenly, every flower facing the same way. Inside the house, the air was still and dry. The woman who lived there, dressed in pale blue, greeted her gently and asked her to stay for tea. Nothing seemed threatening. The woman smiled, offered honey and warm bread, and asked questions about her family. But the child couldn't eat. Something in the woman's eyes made her feel as if she were being unwrapped slowly, layer by layer, as if the woman already knew the answers. When she left, the woman pressed a small coin into her palm and said, "Tell no one what you saw, and you'll never be afraid again." The child obeyed. She never returned to the house, but she kept the coin hidden in a drawer for decades. She could never bring herself to throw it away. It wasn't a threat, she told her granddaughter. It was a promise. Years after the woman disappeared, strange things continued to happen. Candles flickered near the house, though no one lived there. Dogs barked toward the cliffs, their fur standing up without warning. And sometimes, very late at night, a single bell would ring from the tower, a bell no one had touched in years. Locals made peace with it in their own way. Some said it was the wind. Some said it was guilt carried by the land itself. But most simply avoided the place, never speaking her name aloud, as if silence offered some kind of protection. You might wonder why this story belongs in a series about cruel people from medieval history. After all, where's the violence? Where's the blood? But cruelty is not always about what's visible. Some of the darkest chapters in human history are written not in swords or fire, but in choices, in manipulation, in control, so subtle it looks like kindness until it's too late. She taught a generation that mercy was dangerous, that trust was a weakness, and that silence was safety. People forgot how to speak freely, how to love without caution, how to live without glancing over their shoulders. She didn't just hurt people. She changed them, and perhaps that's what sets her apart from others on this list. Her story doesn't come with a body count. It comes with a chill, a discomfort that lingers long after the telling, a sense that someone is still listening. Even now, scholars sometimes stumble upon fragments of her life, fragments carefully hidden in unrelated records. A letter from a noble requesting her counsel, a ledger that suddenly balances after months of chaos, right after a visit from a woman with unusual grace. Notes from a court servant describing the quiet visitor who left behind no scent, no sound, only agreement. Her influence didn't end when she vanished. It only became harder to trace. One historian, writing under a pen name centuries later, described her legacy as a whispered disease, something that couldn't be cured, only avoided. He concluded his research with a chilling line, "Asterisk, we may not know her name, but we are still living in the world she taught us to fear." Asterisk, and maybe that's true. In the darkest hours of the night, when the world is silent and even the stars seem to pause, there are stories that return uninvited. Stories that remind us how easily fear can wear a friendly face, how power doesn't always need a crown, and how the cruelest people may never touch you, but they still leave you changed. Her name is gone now. Her house stands empty, but the wind still moves around the cliff as if careful not to disturb something sleeping. And if you ever find yourself walking there and feel the sudden urge to look over your shoulder, don't. Just keep walking, because even now, she may still be watching. In the village nearest the cliff, the silence had settled too deeply. Not the natural quiet of wind through trees or the distant rush of the sea, but a stillness that wrapped itself around the people. Children no longer played near the streams. The church bell rang softer than before, and conversation stopped whenever anyone mentioned the house. Over the years, fear had turned into habit, and habit turned into superstition. But something had begun to stir again, something the villagers couldn't quite name. It started with the birds. One by one, they stopped flying near the cliffside. First the swallows, then the crows. Farmers noticed it during early morning walks. The skies, usually alive with flutter and song, grew empty. A hunter returned pale one evening after tracking a deer into the woods. He claimed he saw someone standing at the edge of the path, someone tall and still. He didn't see her face, just the way the trees bowed slightly, as if leaning away from her. His story might have been dismissed as nonsense if not for what came next. A fire broke out in the far field. No lightning, no storm, just sudden flame under clear skies. By the time the villagers reached it, Nothing remained but blackened earth. In the center of the scorched patch, they found a single wooden spoon. Simple, unburned, and carved into the handle, barely visible, was a symbol no one recognized but felt somehow familiar. A small circle, wrapped in a delicate line like a snare. Whispers began again. Older villagers started locking their doors earlier. A few left altogether, claiming it wasn't worth the risk to stay near something cursed. But others weren't so sure. There were those who believed she had returned, and there were those who believed she had never left. Elena, a young midwife who had moved to the village 2 years earlier, didn't believe in ghost stories. She was kind, thoughtful, and patient, traits that made her both trusted and quietly admired. She listened more than she spoke. But lately, she had been waking up at night, always at the same hour, just after the moon reached its highest point. She couldn't explain why, only that it felt like something was waiting, listening for her breath, watching her thoughts. It wasn't fear, not at first, just unease. But then she found the note, folded neatly on her doorstep one morning, sealed with wax so thin it cracked at her touch. No name, no return address. Inside, in careful handwriting, it read, Asterisk, you've seen her, haven't you? She's still here. Trust nothing that smiles. Asterisk. Elena didn't tell anyone. She tucked the note into her medical pouch and pretended it hadn't happened. But from that day on, her dreams grew darker. She began to remember things she shouldn't have known, snatches of memory that didn't belong to her. A garden with matching roses, a silver ring with a chipped gem, the sound of a lullaby sung in a language she'd never heard. And in the middle of it all, a woman with gray eyes. In the neighboring village, an older man named Rurik had begun digging through the church's old records. He wasn't looking for her, not exactly. He was searching for answers to a different problem, a sudden illness spreading quietly among the livestock. Cattle had begun dying without explanation. No visible wounds, no signs of infection, just collapsed, as if their hearts had stopped. The first few were thought to be old age, but when younger animals fell, panic set in. Rurik, once a scholar before he retired into farming, had a mind for patterns. And something about this illness felt familiar. Too familiar. He had seen something like it once in a manuscript, years ago, when he was a student in the mountain monastery. A reference to a sickness called hollowing, a condition that had once struck an entire village centuries earlier. No blood, no rot, just a slow, creeping emptiness that pulled the life out of things. The last time it happened, it had been near a cliff, near a woman no one dared name. As he searched through records, he found a single torn page, marked with that same looping symbol Elena had seen, though he didn't know she had seen it too. A circle, snared in its own line. It was described not as a mark of evil, but as a signature of control, something used to bind others without chains. Rurik began to suspect the truth, not that she had returned, but that she had never needed to. Because what if the cruelty wasn't tied to a person? What if it was something deeper, a pattern passed along, a method, a belief, one that lived quietly in those willing to listen, willing to carry it forward? Meanwhile, in the woods closer to the sea, a man named Ephraim had taken up watching the house. He didn't tell anyone. He just wandered there every morning at dawn, stood far off behind the trees, and stared at the windows. They were always dark, but once, just once, he saw something move. Not a shadow, not a curtain, a face. It was only for a moment. Pale, expressionless, gone in a blink. Ephraim stayed longer each day after that. He started carving the symbol into small pieces of wood, leaving them at the base of trees. He said nothing, even when people noticed how withdrawn he had become. He simply said he felt closer to the truth. The conflict was no longer about one woman or one house. It had spread like smoke into minds, into dreams, into everyday lives. It wasn't clear who was leading or who was following, but something was building. Old fear, new signs, strange sickness, and none of it could be traced directly back to her. That was her way. No evidence, no confession, only a trail of changes no one could explain. And across the villages, behind the smiles, behind the calm voices and kind hands, the same thought crept in like fog under a door. If she truly taught the world how to control without cruelty, how to dominate without noise, then how many others had learned? How many, even now, were waiting to take her place? The tension pulled tighter, threads winding into knots just out of reach. No one knew what came next, but everyone could feel it. Something was shifting. The cruelest figure in medieval history may have vanished, but her story was far from over. One fog-heavy morning, a cart passed through the old stone path toward the cliff. The wheels creaked over moss-covered cobbles as a young scribe named Julian made his way toward the forgotten manor. He wasn't from the village. He had traveled from a far side of the kingdom, guided only by scraps of rumor and a personal obsession. Julian had spent years chasing whispers, strange events, untold histories, censored pages. In every corner of every archive he touched, her trace lingered just beneath the surface. He never found her name, but he found her pattern. Julian had seen the symbol too. It was etched on a shelf in a ruined chapel, barely visible under layers of dust. It was drawn faintly in charcoal inside the margin of a noble's will. It was scratched into a servant's wooden comb, now sealed behind glass in a museum. Always the same design, subtle, curved, inescapable. His curiosity had started as scholarly interest, but now it had become something else. A compulsion. He needed to see where she lived. He needed to stand in the place where the quiet cruelty had taken root, not to confront it, but to understand it. As he reached the edge of the overgrown garden, the silence thickened. Birds avoided the trees. The grass, still wet with morning dew, gave off a scent that didn't belong. Neither fresh nor rotting, but sharp, metallic like old keys. The house loomed ahead, cracked with age but still proud in its stance. The door was closed but not locked. Julian didn't hesitate. Inside, the air was stale but not decayed. Dust floated in soft layers, as if untouched for years. Furniture remained where it had always been. A vase sat on the mantelpiece, still holding the dried stems of something once red. In the corner of the room, beneath a faded tapestry, was a small writing desk. Julian's fingers trembled as he opened the drawer. Inside, folded carefully, was a single piece of parchment. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. Asterisk. Those who rule through fear do not need to raise their voices. The quietest hands write the longest stories. Asterisk. There was no signature, only the symbol. Julian stayed in the house for hours. He examined every room, every wall, every mark. He found no other writings, no diary, no hidden confession. Just the overwhelming sense that nothing had ever truly left. The structure held memory in its bones. When he finally emerged, the sun had already dipped low in the sky. The villagers saw him return, but didn't ask questions. They saw the change in his face, his wide eyes, his silence. That night, Julian did not sleep, and by morning, he was gone. No one knows what happened to him. Some said he returned to the capital. Others believed he vanished into the sea, driven mad by the stories he'd uncovered. But the people who lived nearest the cliff didn't question his disappearance. They simply added it to the long, quiet list. Back in the village, Elena, the midwife, had also grown quiet. Since the day she received the note, her dreams had deepened. She had begun drawing the symbol in her notebook without realizing it. Once, she caught herself humming a melody she didn't know, one that made her chest feel tight. She stopped treating patients near the forest and started keeping a candle burning through the night, though she never said why. Rurik, the retired scholar, had grown ill. His hair grayed faster, and his hands shook. He had locked away the church records he found, warning the clergy to leave them sealed. One evening, before retreating into the woods, he muttered to a neighbor, "She is not gone. She's only changed her face." And perhaps that was true, because what if she no longer needed a house? What if she no longer needed a name? What if her legacy now lived inside those who had been changed by her? Passed on not by blood, but by thought, by fear, by quiet agreement. There were signs, even if most ignored them. A councilman in the next village outlawed public assemblies without explanation. A schoolmaster rewrote a history book to remove details he called too emotional. A baker stopped speaking to his wife after she began asking too many questions. Each decision was small, justified, harmless on the surface, but each carried the mark of that same cold logic, that same subtle control. The cruelty that once lived on a cliff now lived in decisions made behind closed doors. It lived in hesitation, in silence, in the stories people stopped telling. One stormy evening, as wind whipped through the valley and windows rattled in their frames, a young girl named Morel stood at the edge of the forest. She was no older than 10, curious and fearless in the way children sometimes are before the world teaches them caution. She had heard the tales, the warnings, but something inside her needed to see. She didn't find the house that night. The trees grew too thick. The path bent in ways that didn't match her memory. But what she did find was a stone, perfectly round, etched with the same symbol. She picked it up and carried it home. And just before she fell asleep, she tucked it under her pillow. No one knows what she dreamed that night. But the next morning, she no longer asked about the woman on the cliff. She no longer asked questions at all. And so the story loops again. The pattern holds. Cruelty doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it tiptoes in smiling. Sometimes it comes through old stories, folded letters, forgotten stones. And those who listen too long may find themselves changed, slowly, gently, without realizing it. This is how it spreads. This is how it survives. Not in fire, not in war, but in quiet rooms and quiet minds. And if tonight, as you drift into sleep, you feel that someone or something is still out there, watching with gray eyes and steady breath, don't worry. It's just history, and history never truly sleeps. Not far from the village, nestled in the tall grass behind a crumbling chapel wall, a boy named Luca found something buried beneath the earth. He had been helping his grandfather clear brush and weeds when his foot struck a piece of iron poking through the dirt. Curious, he dropped to his knees and dug with both hands until he uncovered the shape fully. A small iron box, rusted at the hinges, its surface marked faintly with a circle encased in a looping snare. He didn't open it right away. He brought it to his grandfather, expecting perhaps coins or relics or an old family keepsake. But the moment the old man saw it, his face changed. Not in fear, not in shock, but in something much colder. Recognition. He whispered, "Put it back." But Luca couldn't. He was too curious, too pulled in. That night, when everyone was asleep, he crept outside with a small lantern, set the box on a tree stump, and opened it. Inside, he found a bundle of parchment bound with black string. No names, no dates, just page after page of careful writing in neat, slanted script. Thoughts, rules, principles. One page read, "Asterisk, to control without violence is the highest skill. To be obeyed without speaking is the highest power. The best leaders are never seen. They are only remembered." Asterisk. Another read, "Asterisk, remove uncertainty, and people will follow. Remove comfort, and they will obey. Remove choice, and they will call it destiny." Asterisk. The writing was elegant, precise, calculated, and Luca read until the candle burned out. The next day, he spoke less. Over the weeks that followed, the change was slow, but unmistakable. He began observing people differently, listening more than talking, learning where people's fears lived and where their weaknesses showed. He never hurt anyone. He never shouted. But within a month, the other children began following him. Not out of friendship, but something deeper, a quiet gravity he seemed to carry without effort. He never told anyone what was in a box. But his grandfather knew, and one evening, the old man packed a small satchel and walked toward the hills. He never returned. The village noticed these things, of course. But people were tired, worn down by years of quiet dread and sleepless nights. When the signs began again, the strange dreams, the flickering candles in empty homes, the fog that never lifted, most people didn't question it. They simply looked the other way, the way their grandparents had. And in that silence, the legacy continued. Somewhere deep in the capital city, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Royal Archives, a historian named Odette sat alone by candlelight. Her hands were ink-stained, her back sore from long hours leaning over aged parchment. She had spent a decade researching forgotten women of the medieval world. Queens without thrones, saints without canonization, scholars whose works were buried in basements. She wasn't searching for the cruel woman, not at first, but as her research deepened, she began to notice a pattern, a set of references too frequent to be coincidence. Letters that alluded to a gray lady, treatises on law that cited a noble woman of the north without name, instructional scrolls for quiet diplomacy that echoed the very same ideas found in the iron box. When she followed the trail to the coast, to the region near the cliffs, the locals were hesitant to speak. One man gave her directions to the house with a trembling hand. A woman warned her to stay away, but Odette had no intention of turning back. She walked the path alone, passing under trees that leaned like they were listening. She reached the edge of the cliff just before nightfall. The house still stood, tired, weather-beaten, but intact. She walked through the threshold without knocking. The interior was just as the rumors had described, untouched by time, preserved in some unnatural way. She moved carefully through the rooms, pausing by the empty fireplace, the long dining table, the thick velvet curtains that hadn't moved in years. Then she found a mirror, tall, dusty, rimmed in brass, covered mostly by a sheet. But when she pulled the cloth aside, she didn't see her own face. Instead, she saw a woman, tall, straight-backed, dressed in muted blue. Her gray eyes stared directly into Odette's, and her lips curved into the faintest smile. Odette didn't run. She stared back, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not visions, just understanding. The mirror returned her reflection a moment later, but she knew it wasn't just her anymore. Something had shifted. She left the house quietly. Back in the city, Odette didn't speak of what she saw. She resumed her work. She continued writing her papers. But something had changed in her tone, more deliberate, more focused. Her influence grew. She was invited to councils, asked to advise decisions, consulted for policy. And people began to follow her. Not loudly, not openly, but naturally, inevitably. It wasn't that she had become the cruel woman. It was that the cruel woman's teachings had found a new vessel. That's how the legacy spread. Not through blood or conquest, but through quiet minds, receptive hearts, and people who believed that power didn't need to roar. And all across the land, the signs returned. Small at first. Forgotten roads lined with snare symbols carved in stone. Letters that arrived with no sender, but knew just what to say. People changing, not by force, but by slow, steady erosion of will. A girl stops singing without knowing why. A man burns his journals out of sudden guilt. A priest forgets the names of his childhood friends. These aren't accidents. They're echoes. Because cruelty, the kind that doesn't scar the skin but the soul, never truly dies. It doesn't need a throne or a blade. It only needs belief. And belief spreads. Even now, as the night wraps gently around your mind and sleep begins to call you towards silence, the story remains. Not as a warning, not even as a memory, but as a pattern, a presence. She may be gone, but she taught the world too well. The days grew shorter. Clouds hung lower in the sky, and the wind off the sea carried a weight no one could name. In the village near the cliffs, something was changing again, quietly but unmistakably. People spoke less. Children stopped playing outside altogether. The tavern, once filled with warmth and stories, now stood nearly empty each night. And when the candles flickered without a breeze, no one dared ask why. Elena noticed it first in the way people looked at her. She wasn't sure when it started, but one morning, as she stepped out to fetch water, 3 neighbors turned away from her with empty expressions. Not anger, not fear, just distance. She stood still for a long moment, watching the backs of their heads as they disappeared down the road. Something was wrong, not just with them, but with her too. Dreams had become more vivid. Her thoughts, once sharp, felt slow and unsure. Sometimes she would forget what day it was or where she had put something only minutes before. And every time she tried to write, her hands would tremble, as if the very act of putting down her thoughts was dangerous. Late one night, unable to sleep, She lit a candle and opened her notebook. She hadn't dared draw the symbol again since the last time. But now, with the village so quiet and her breath feeling tight in her chest, she turned to a blank page. Without thinking, her hand moved. When she blinked, the symbol was there, perfectly drawn. Not shaky, not unsure. Her fingers had moved as though they had drawn it 1,000 times. She stared at it, heart pounding, feeling as though she had just unlocked something she wasn't meant to remember. Across the village, in the cramped room of the old rectory, Rurik lay sleepless. His body had grown too frail for long walks, but his mind remained sharp, sharper than anyone realized. He had seen these signs before, decades ago, when he was younger and traveling through the far northern territories. A similar silence had taken over a village there, too. A similar pattern of forgetting, of watching, of obeying. That village was now gone, abandoned, swallowed by moss and snow. And Rurik had been the only one who ever wrote about it. He had tried to warn the church, tried to send letters to the capital, but they were never answered. His words, he believed, had been intercepted, or worse, ignored by those who already understood what he was dealing with. Now it was happening again. He rose from bed that night with effort, wrapped himself in a thick cloak, and made his way to the church library. He kept a small iron key hidden beneath the floorboard, a key that opened the last drawer of the bottom cabinet, the one no one touched. Inside were notes, diagrams, broken maps, and torn pages from old manuscripts he had rescued over the years. He spread them across the table, scanning each one under a dim lantern. And there was again that symbol. It didn't belong to a house or a family or a nation. It belonged to a method, a belief system without a name, something ancient and quietly passed along like a sickness that required no contact, just thought. Rurik began to copy down what he knew. If anything happened to him, someone needed to understand the signs. Someone needed to fight it. But the air around him shifted. He looked up. The door to the library was open. He hadn't opened it. The lantern flickered, and for a brief second, he saw her. Not the woman herself, but the shape, the posture, the presence, standing in the shadows just outside the door, watching him, silent as breath. And then she was gone. Back at the edge of the forest, young Luca stood beneath the moonlight. The iron box lay open beside him on the cold ground, pages fluttering in the breeze. He wasn't afraid. He felt something deeper than fear now, a sense of certainty. The teachings inside the box made more sense to him than anything else in his life had. He saw how easily people fell apart under pressure, how quickly they followed those who gave them a reason not to think for themselves. He had read every word, memorized every line, and now something was calling him toward the cliff. The old house, though abandoned, had begun to feel alive again. Its windows reflected moonlight even when the sky was black. Its door swayed gently even when the wind was still. And at night, voices could be heard from inside, not loud, not even clear, just whispers, soft and strange, as if the house was remembering all the words that had ever been spoken within it. Odette, far from the cliffs now, but deeply changed, had begun writing a book. She called it a history of forgotten influence, but it was more than that. It was a manual. She never wrote her name on the cover, and she never submitted it to a publisher. But copies began to appear anyway. One found its way into a merchant's satchel. Another was left behind in a government office. The writing inside was compelling, almost hypnotic, and every copy bore the same mark on its final page. The symbol. None of the pieces felt connected yet, but they were. The sickness in the animals, the silence in the village, the sudden changes in people's behavior, the dreams, the memories that didn't belong. All of it pointed to something gathering, something rebuilding. Not one person, not one house, but a movement. And the worst part? No one could stop it, because most people didn't even realize it had started. Back near the cliffs, Elena lit a lantern and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She didn't know why she was walking, only that she had to. Her feet moved on their own. The path beneath her seemed clearer than it ever had before. The trees didn't creak. The sea was silent. Ahead, the house stood with its door wide open. Inside, A single chair faced the hearth. The candle on the mantel was already lit, and sitting in the chair was a figure. Elena didn't speak. She stepped inside, heart pounding, every nerve in her body screaming for her to run. But she didn't, because as she looked into the gray eyes of the woman across from her, she realized something chilling. She had seen those eyes before, in a mirror, in her dreams, in herself. And in that moment, standing in the house where the story began, she understood. The cruelty hadn't survived by force. It had survived by invitation. And someone long ago had invited it into her. The tension thickened, every breath sharp as frost. The world outside fell silent, the sea paused, and the next moment, whatever it would be, held everything. The choice, the truth, the turning point. But that moment hadn't come. Not yet. The air inside the house was thick, not with dust, not with heat, but with something unseen, something Elena could feel pressing gently against her skin, wrapping around her thoughts like fog around glass. She stood just beyond the threshold, her hands still on the doorframe, the candlelight flickering against the edges of her face. The figure in the chair didn't move. The flames in the hearth crackled softly, casting long shadows across the stone walls. It wasn't fear that rooted Elena in place. It was recognition. And that was far worse. Because what do you do when the thing you feared most looks back at you through your own eyes? The woman sitting in the chair looked older than Elena, but not by much. Her features were sharp, yet calm. Her mouth was neither smiling nor frowning. It simply waited. But it was the eyes, those pale, gray, storm-worn eyes, that spoke the loudest. They were patient, ancient, knowing, as if they'd seen not just Elena's life, but generations before it. As if they'd seen this moment many times before. Elena took a single step forward. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "Who are you?" The woman didn't blink. "That depends on what you believe." It wasn't a riddle, though it felt like one. The woman's voice was soft, almost too soft, like the sound of leaves shifting just before a storm. But it carried weight. Elena felt her heart speed up, her breathing shallow. "I've read about you," she whispered. "They all talk about you like you disappeared." The woman leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching in her eyes. Disappearance is a choice. Just like silence. Just like survival. Elena shook her head. "You ruined people. You made them afraid to live. You turned silence into law." There was no anger in the woman's face. "Did I?" she said. "Or did I simply show them how fragile they truly were?" Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that the villagers had suffered, that entire families had been pulled apart, that kindness had become currency, and suspicion a daily habit. But deep down, something inside her hesitated. A thought she didn't want to have. A question she wasn't ready to face. What if the woman wasn't wrong? What if the world had simply taken what she taught and revealed itself? Outside the house, the wind picked up. The trees swayed gently, their branches clicking like bones. From the cliffside, a low sound rose, a hollow moan, like the sea breathing in reverse. Something old was waking. In the village below, Rurik sat hunched at his desk, hands trembling over the pages of his notes. He had connected more pieces, more than he wanted to. The name Odette appeared in multiple accounts now. He had traced her influence into political circles, university boards, even religious councils. Quiet, calm, but always decisive. Her words were being quoted by people who didn't even know where they had first heard them. And in the margins of those speeches, always the same symbol. A circle, wrapped in its own line. Rurik's vision blurred as he reached for his quill, trying to write faster than the realization unraveling in his mind. This wasn't a person they were facing. It was an idea, a method that could wear any face, walk in any body. And once it found someone to carry it, someone willing or broken enough, it would take root. It had taken root in Elena. In the woods, young Luca stood beneath the bent trees, staring at the house from a distance. He didn't move. He didn't blink. The iron box lay open beside his feet. The writings inside were gone, carried by the wind or memorized into his bones. His lips moved, repeating lines only he could hear. Order is peace. Peace is obedience. Obedience is strength. He took a step forward. Back in the house, Elena felt her hands begin to shake. The woman had not risen. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the room like smoke, curling around every surface, seeping into the walls. Elena tried to look away, but her gaze kept returning to those eyes. They weren't hypnotizing. They weren't magical. They were worse. They were familiar. "You're not here," Elena said slowly. "You're in me." The woman didn't answer. She simply tilted her head, just slightly, like a teacher waiting for a student to finish solving a riddle they'd already been given the answer to. "I've seen things I shouldn't have seen, dreamed things I couldn't know, felt things that weren't mine. And yet," the woman said gently, "you came." Elena's breath caught. "You didn't make me come," she whispered. "I chose it." The woman stood. It was a slow, deliberate movement, unhurried, graceful, final. She walked toward Elena, not with menace, but with purpose. Each step echoed like it mattered, like it was meant to be remembered. "I never force," she said. "I never command. I only show the truth. And the truth is simple. People don't want freedom. They want certainty." She reached in her cloak and pulled something small and round. A stone, smooth and cold, etched with the same symbol. She placed it in Elena's hand and closed her fingers around it. "Now choose," she said. The fire dimmed. The shadows thickened. Outside, the forest groaned. And far down the path, Luca's footsteps reached the door. In that suspended moment, between breath and decision, between fear and surrender, the world seemed to pause. Rurik, gripping the edge of his desk, felt a pressure in his chest like time closing in. Odette, standing before a mirror in her quiet office, looked into her own reflection and saw someone else staring back. The sea clawed at the cliffside with greater force. The sky held its clouds like it was afraid to let them fall. Elena opened her hand. The stone pulsed. The woman's eyes never left hers. And something, everything, was about to break. The moment the stone touched Elena's skin, a pulse moved through her, small at first, like the tickle of static, but then stronger, deeper. It wasn't painful, but it was powerful, as if something ancient and vast had opened its eyes inside her. Her breath caught, and the walls of the house seemed to lean closer. The fire dimmed to embers, casting the room in a strange glow, neither warm nor cold. The woman stepped back, her hands folding in front of her like her work was done. But Elena didn't move. Her heart raced, not out of fear anymore, but because she understood that something irreversible had just happened. She looked down at the stone in her palm, still glowing faintly, the symbol etched into it now warm to the touch. She tried to let it go, but her hand didn't respond. Her fingers clutched it as though they were no longer hers. The woman watched in silence. "You've already decided," she said softly. "No," Elena replied, her voice shaking. "I haven't." The woman smiled, but it wasn't cruel. It was almost kind. That's what they all say, right before they forget. Elena stumbled back, her shoulder brushing the frame of the doorway. The cool wood grounded her, brought her back for a moment. She took a breath, trying to push through the fog that was building her mind. A fog that whispered things in her own voice. Asterisk, let go. Rest. You don't have to fight. Asterisk. But another part of her, buried, faint, still resisted. A memory flared in her mind. Her mother's voice when she was a child, telling her stories by the fire. Stories of courage. Stories of people who did the right thing, even when they were terrified. She had believed in those stories once. And then she heard footsteps behind her. Slow. Careful. Luca. She turned just as he stepped inside, his eyes wide, shining in the dim light. His hands were empty, but something about the way he moved made her skin prickle. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. He looked like he had been expected. The woman turned to him and nodded. "You've come far," she said gently. "You read well." Luca didn't respond. He walked toward her, and Elena saw the same symbol etched faintly on his wrist, burned into his skin, a quiet brand. "No," Elena whispered. "He's just a boy." The woman looked at her. "So was I once." And in that moment, Elena saw it. Not the woman as she was now, but who she had been before. A child, Once full of questions, full of kindness, slowly molded by cold truths, by fear, by control dressed as safety. She hadn't been born cruel. She had been taught. Elena stepped in front of Luca, shielding him. "You don't have to do this," she told him. "You can still choose." His expression shifted. Just a flicker, a crease between his brows. Doubt. The woman's voice was still soft, still careful. "You misunderstand. I'm not making him do anything. I never have. People find me when they're ready. When they're tired of pretending the world makes sense." "I'm not ready," Elena said firmly. The woman tilted her head. "Then why are you here?" Elena looked at the stone, still clutched in her hand. It felt heavier now, like a chain. She tried again to let go, and this time, her fingers opened. The stone dropped to the floor with a dull clink. The sound echoed, and the woman's expression changed. Just for a second, something like surprise. Luca looked from Elena to the woman and back again. The room pulsed again, light flickering, the walls tightening, and suddenly, the house didn't feel so timeless. It felt unstable, like it had been holding its breath for too long. Elena turned to Luca. "You can choose too," she whispered. "She doesn't own you." The boy's lips parted as if he might speak. But then the woman stepped closer, and her voice sharpened. Not loud, but pointed. "He belongs to the silence now." "No," Elena said, and she reached out and grabbed Luca's hand. The moment their hands touched, something cracked. Not in the air, not in the room, but in the space between what had been and what could be. A fracture, invisible but real, split the tension that had been building for generations. The whispers stopped. The fire hissed and died. The walls of the house groaned as though something inside them had been broken. The woman took a step back. "No," she said, her voice low, almost confused. "That's not how it works." Elena held onto Luca tightly, anchoring both of them. "Maybe it is." The stone on the floor rolled slightly, then shattered. A sharp, sudden snap, like bone splitting but deeper. The symbol burned away in ash, and the room felt lighter. Just slightly. Luca blinked. His eyes cleared. He looked at the woman, then at Elena. "I don't want this," he whispered. The woman's hands trembled. "Everything I've built," she said. "All this time. You think you could just walk away from it?" Elena stared at her, chest heaving. "Yes." The word echoed in the house like thunder, and the crack spread. The woman stepped backward, now visibly shaken. The house moaned louder, beams shifting above them. The walls seemed to tremble under the weight of something unseen. A power long held, now slipping loose. "You came to me," the woman said. "You wanted to understand." "I did," Elena replied. "And now I do." Outside, the wind howled. In the village below, Rurik clutched his chest as the same pressure that had haunted his sleep now roared like a scream through his bones. He felt it, the break, the change, something ending. Odette, in the city, looked up from her writing as her mirror cracked without warning. Her hand shook, the pen in her grip suddenly heavier than she could bear. She stood, watching her own reflection shatter into dozens of versions of herself, all staring back with knowing eyes. The pattern was breaking, but inside the house on the cliff, the final moment had not come. Not yet. The woman stood still, her gray eyes dull now, her presence dimming. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This isn't the end." Elena didn't answer. She turned, still holding Luca's hand, and stepped back into the doorway. The night air hit her like a wave. It was sharp and cold, but real. Clean. Behind her, the house groaned louder. Beams creaked. Glass cracked. But they didn't look back. The most intense moment hadn't passed, because the house had one last breath to take, and it was about to exhale. The night outside the house was colder than before, but it was not the kind of cold that came from wind or sea. It was the kind of cold that felt like something had gone missing, something essential. Elena held Luca's hand tightly as they stepped away from the doorway. Behind them, the house groaned again, but it did not collapse. Instead, it seemed to sink slightly into the earth, as if exhaling slowly after holding in its breath for centuries. But they didn't speak. Not yet. Every step down the path felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was reluctant to let them leave. At the edge of the forest, Elena finally paused and looked back over her shoulder. The house stood still, but a faint red glow pulsed from its windows. It was different than fire. It was soft, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Luca tugged her hand. "We should go," he said. Elena nodded, but something inside her clenched. She turned back toward the village, and they walked in silence through the trees. But with each step, Elena felt a strange tug in her chest. Not fear, not dread. A pull, like she was being watched not from the house behind them, but from somewhere deeper. Deeper than the forest. Deeper than memory. When they reached the edge of the village, it was completely still. Too still. The streets were empty. No torches lit the alleyways. The usual smells of smoke and bread were gone. Even the dogs, normally barking from behind fences, were silent. Then Luca pointed. At the center of the village square, a tall figure stood under the clock tower. Not moving, not speaking, just waiting. Elena narrowed her eyes. "Is that?" But she didn't finish the thought. As they stepped closer, her stomach turned. The figure was wrapped in a dark cloak, the kind worn by clergy, but the face beneath the hood wasn't one she expected. It was Rurik, only his eyes were no longer soft and aged. They were bright, too bright, unnatural, and in his hand, he held the same stone she had dropped in the house. Elena froze. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." She had watched that stone crack and shatter. She had felt it burn out in her palm, like it had lost its power. But now here it was whole again, glowing stronger than ever. Rurik lifted his head slowly and spoke. But it wasn't his voice. You thought she was the end of the story. Elena stepped forward. "Rurik, what are you doing?" His smile was soft, almost peaceful. "She was never alone," he said. Behind him, the village bell rang once, even though no one pulled the rope. It was a low, slow sound, and it echoed far too long. The houses around the square flickered to life, but not with candlelight. The glow in the windows was the same dull red as the one from the house. Steady, pulsing. Elena's heart pounded. This isn't real. But Rurik. No, something wearing Rurik raised the stone higher. "It's not about the house," he said. "It never was. That was only a seed." Lucas stepped behind Elena now, gripping her arm. "I don't like this," he whispered. Elena barely heard him. Her focus was on the windows, more and more lighting up with that same eerie glow. The entire village had gone silent not out of fear, but out of participation. They weren't victims anymore. They were part of it. And then came the second crack. Not in stone, not in air, but deep within Elena's own thoughts. A realization she hadn't dared to consider until now. The woman in the house hadn't been trying to claim her. She'd been protecting her, or trying to, because there was something worse. The real cruelty, the true legacy of medieval control, wasn't in the woman's teachings. It was in how those teachings had evolved, spread, fragmented, rewritten, misused, and now it had taken root in people who had never even met her. Elena stumbled back, suddenly dizzy. "This is bigger than her," she whispered. Rurik nodded slowly. "It always was." Luca tugged her again. Elena looked. Across the square, the chapel doors slammed open, and dozens of villagers emerged in silence. Their eyes glowed. Their hands clutched small objects, carved wooden tokens, smooth stones, rusted rings, all marked with the same ancient symbol. The one she had seen carved into mirrors, buried under chapels, drawn in notebooks. The one she had once thought was hers alone. Now it was everywhere. Elena took a step back, pulling Luca with her. "Run," she whispered. But there was nowhere to go, because as they turned to flee, they saw the forest behind them flickering with red lights, torches being lit one by one in synchronized rhythm. And among them stood figures she didn't recognize. Outsiders. People drawn by the same invisible pull. People who had followed the same teachings from faraway lands, unknowingly connected by a belief so quiet, so old, it didn't need language anymore. It had become instinct. The circle wasn't just a mark. It was a system, a way of thinking. And Elena, in trying to break free, had only awakened the deeper web. She stood in the center of the village now, surrounded, heart thundering. Her hand was shaking again, but not with fear, with anger. She looked back at Rurik. "What do you want?" He answered, "What we were always promised, order." And behind him, in the growing crowd, another voice answered too. But it came from Odette, not in person, through a voice carried on wind, distant but clear, speaking from somewhere far beyond the village. "The age of influence isn't over," she said. "It's just learned to hide in plain sight." The villagers raised their hands in unison. The lights pulsed once more, and the night held its breath. Because the war for control wasn't coming. It had already begun. Elena could barely hear her own thoughts over the quiet rising in the air. A silence so complete it felt like sound turned inside out. The villagers stood perfectly still, each holding their symbol-marked object like it was sacred. Even Luca stopped breathing for a moment, his eyes darting between the glowing windows, the torchlit forest, and the still figure of Rurik. But Elena's mind was racing. The pieces were finally fitting together, and what she saw was far worse than anything she'd imagined. This wasn't about one cruel woman in a forgotten house. It wasn't even about the town or its past. It was about an old idea that had woven itself into the world's bones. One that had survived kings and plagues, revolutions and rewrites. It didn't need an army. It only needed belief. And now it was everywhere. She gripped Luca's hand and whispered, "We can't run." He looked up, startled. "Then what do we do?" "We move forward." She stepped toward Rurik. Not fast, not aggressively, just enough to show she wasn't afraid. His face didn't change, but the red light in his eyes pulsed brighter for a moment, like some part of the force behind him recognized the shift. "I understand now," she said. Her voice was calm, but inside her chest, her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "You're not here to destroy anything. You're here to preserve it, to keep the world exactly as it is." Rurik tilted his head slightly. "And is that such a terrible thing?" "It is," Elena said, "if it means no one gets to ask questions. If it means fear becomes comfort and control becomes love." The villagers remained motionless, but something flickered in a few of their expressions. Just barely. A twitch of the hand. A glance sideways. Doubt. Elena stepped closer still. "This whole time, I thought I was being pulled into something ancient and evil. But now I see it's not ancient. It's evolving. It changes with each generation, each face, each leader. That's why you're using Rurik. That's why Odette's voice came through the wind. You don't need the old symbols anymore. You've made a new language, one made of fear disguised as reason." Rurik didn't respond, but behind him, the crowd shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elena caught it. The spell wasn't broken, but the cracks were forming. She pressed on. "You teach people that silence is peace, that obedience is strength. You tell them they're safe if they just stop asking questions. But you're wrong. Real safety comes from being heard. Real peace comes from being free to think. You're not offering safety. You're offering sleep." She turned slightly so the villagers could see her face, her eyes wide and open. "And we've all been asleep for too long." The torches in the forest wavered. One of them flickered out. Rurik's eyes narrowed. "You think your words matter," he said. "You're still clinging to the illusion that one voice can undo a system." Elena didn't look away. "Maybe not," she replied. "But doubt can." A sharp wind whipped through the square. The red lights in the houses blinked once, then steadied. The energy in the air shifted again, no longer just heavy, but unstable, like static just before a lightning strike. And then, another twist. From behind the church, a second figure stepped into the square. Elena froze. It was the woman from the house. Not a vision, not a memory. She was real, and she wasn't alone. Behind her came others, strangers, cloaked figures, faces from different regions, even one man wearing the robes of the southern monasteries. People Elena had never seen before, but who each bore signs of awareness in their eyes. Survivors, maybe. Witnesses. Rebels. The woman walked to Elena's side, the cloak sweeping behind her like a shadow. "You were never meant to carry this alone," she said. Rurik's expression cracked for the first time. You, he breathed. The woman smiled, but this time there was something different in it. Something new. No, she replied. We. She turned to the villagers, her voice loud enough to carry but still calm, steady. You've been told that silence is safety, that control is kindness. But those ideas didn't start with me. They started with fear, and fear has taken many faces since. My teachings were never meant to be law. They were warnings. Misunderstood, twisted, used. She looked at Rurik. You're not a teacher. You're a parasite. The crowd shifted again. Another torch went out. Then another. Odette's voice returned, this time distant, cracked, no longer calm and commanding, but frantic. Don't listen to her. She abandoned the order. She left it broken. The woman looked up at the sky. No, she said. I gave people the choice to leave. You just never told them that part. The wind howled louder. The earth trembled slightly beneath their feet. The stones in the square rattled like teeth. The conflict had shifted into something deeper now. No longer between people, but between ideas. Between the need for control and the hunger for freedom. And then the villagers started moving. One by one, they lowered their hands. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough. Enough for the system to feel it. Elena could see it, like a thread pulled too tight, beginning to unravel. The glow in Rurik's eyes flickered. His shoulders sagged slightly, his mouth opening like he was waking up from a dream. Lucas stepped forward, letting go of Elena's hand. He turned to the crowd and lifted his voice for the first time. I believed it, he said. I believed everything they said. That silence meant strength. That doing nothing was better than doing the wrong thing. But they lied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small page he had folded weeks ago from the iron box. Then he dropped it into the dirt and stepped on it. That sound, soft as paper, was louder than thunder. The wind died. The red lights went out all at once. And in that silence, something broke. Something old. Something invisible. But not something forgotten. Because what happened next would change everything. But it hadn't happened yet. The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavy or oppressive, but raw, like the stillness right after glass shatters. The red lights that had once pulsed so confidently in the windows were now completely gone, leaving behind only the flicker of uncertain torchlight. The villagers, once motionless, began looking around, eyes wide with confusion, as though waking from a long, dreamless sleep. Elena kept her eyes on Rurik. The stone in his hand had dimmed to ash gray, its glow fully extinguished. His shoulders were sagging now, no longer straightened by whatever force had held him. But his face didn't show relief, it showed pain. Deep, tired pain. He blinked once slowly, then again, faster. His lips trembled as if trying to speak, but unsure what words to reach for. Where, he started, but he couldn't finish. The woman from the house stepped forward, her voice low. You were used, she said gently, like many before you. You were convinced that silence was salvation. Rurik looked at her, his eyes swimming with something Elena couldn't define, shame, maybe, or grief. I thought I was preserving something. You were, she said, but not what you believed. All around them, the villagers began murmuring to one another. Some dropped their symbols to the ground. Others held them tightly, uncertain whether to let go or hold on longer. Doubt had taken root, but not all seeds grow the same way. Elena knew this wasn't over. Not yet, because something still lingered in the air, an edge, a question left hanging. Then the bell tolled again, a single, low, mournful strike. But this time, no one had touched the rope. Elena's heart froze. Everyone turned to look at the tower. No wind, no movement, just that one impossible ring, echoing long past where sound should have stopped. And then, without warning, the sky lit up. Not lightning, not fire, a deep red glow that spread across the clouds like ink in water. Elena looked at the woman. What is that? The woman's face went pale. She's trying to anchor it. Anchor what? The woman didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the horizon like she was watching something no one else could see. Then softly, she whispered the idea, the belief. It's not just in minds anymore. It's trying to take form. And that was when the earth cracked. It was faint at first, just a tremor beneath their feet. But then the stones of the square shifted, the ground groaned, and a thin fissure raced down the middle of the village like a scar tearing open. People stumbled backward. The chapel door flew open again, but this time no one stood behind it. Instead, something climbed out. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was a shape, tall, wrapped in layers of cloth or smoke or both. Its face was hidden, but it moved with a terrible grace, like it belonged not in this world but in every thought that had ever shaped it. And etched into its chest, glowing faintly, was the circle and snare symbol. Luca gasped. "What is that?" Elena pulled him behind her. "I don't know, but deep down, Parter did." This wasn't the woman in the house. This was the shadow of every interpretation of her, the distortion of her ideas, the consequences of silence that grew too loud. It didn't need eyes. It didn't need a name, because everyone who looked at it saw something different. An old teacher, a trusted mentor, a calm leader, a voice that once made them feel safe. It had been built from memory, belief, fear, and obedience. It was the system now embodied, and it was here. The villagers stood frozen as it stepped into the square, towering and silent. It didn't speak, but the air seemed to echo with 1,000 whispers anyway, circling everyone's ears in voices that sounded familiar. Asterisk, let me help. Asterisk, asterisk, you're safer when I decide. Asterisk, asterisk, this is what you always wanted. Asterisk, Elena felt her knees weaken. Her mind blurred at the edges. The figure wasn't attacking, but it didn't need to. It was suggesting, and suggestion was more dangerous than any weapon. She could feel it pulling at her thoughts, tempting her to step forward, to hand over control, to believe again. The woman next to her stumbled slightly, gripping her side like something sharp had pierced her without touch. "It's feeding," she said through clenched teeth. "Feeding on memory." Odette's voice came again, this time from every direction. "You thought killing the symbol would end it, but the symbol was only the key. The real power lives in the minds of those who need it." The woman coughed, then shouted, "Don't listen." But it was too late for some. A man on the edge of the square dropped to his knees. A young woman followed. One by one, people began stepping forward, heads low, hands open like they were being pulled by gravity. Elena turned to Luca. "Don't look at it. Look at me." He was shaking. "I can hear it in my head." "So can I," she whispered. "But we don't have to follow it." She grabbed his shoulders. "Remember who you were before the teachings. Remember the silence that wasn't peaceful. Remember how it felt to doubt, to fight, to choose." His eyes flicked to hers, and she saw him come back. The figure raised one long, smoke-draped hand. The ground trembled again. A pressure pushed down on everyone, like the very idea of resistance was being squeezed out of their lungs. The woman stumbled, falling to one knee. Elena rushed to her side. "What do we do?" The woman gasped. "It has no heart, no center. It's only thought made solid. You can't fight it with weapons." "Then how?" She looked up, eyes full of tears. "You have to make people remember." "Remember what?" The woman reached for her hand. The original truth. And Elena understood. She turned to face the village. Not the creature, not the voice, not the illusion, but the people. The human faces behind it all. The ones still swaying under the weight of the lie. She shouted, not with fear, but with fire in her voice. "You've been told this is peace, but look at it. Does it feel like peace?" No answer. She stepped forward. "You've been told silence keeps you safe, but silence is how this thing survives. It can't exist if we remember who we are, if we speak, if we question." The figure's glow pulsed stronger. The wind held again. The pressure increased. But now, eyes were turning. People were watching her, not it. She pressed on. "They used the woman's name to control you. But she's here. She's with us." They twisted her warnings into commands. And we let them. A few villagers stepped back. "Stop believing that safety comes from surrender," she shouted. "Start believing that freedom, real freedom, starts with a question." The figure paused, just for a second. The air shifted. Elena's voice cracked with emotion. "Don't let the worst part of our history define the future. This thing, This idea, this ghost of control, it only exists because we give it space in our minds. Luca shouted beside her, "Let it die!" And someone in the crowd echoed him. "Let it die!" Another voice joined, then another. The pressure broke slightly. The shadow figure trembled, and for the first time, it looked uncertain. The climax hadn't come, but it was close. The figure stood frozen in the square, its smoky, towering form flickering like a candle caught in the wind. The pulses of red light that had once seemed endless began to dim, stuttering like a heartbeat under strain. Around the square, villagers stepped back, now murmuring to each other in broken whispers. Confusion bled into clarity, and clarity gave way to anger, not directed at Elena or the woman, but at themselves. The spell was cracking, but the figure hadn't vanished yet. Its shape shimmered like it couldn't hold itself together much longer, as though the very force animating it was unraveling. Yet still it clung to form. Still it resisted. Its head slowly turned toward Elena, though it had no eyes. Still, she could feel it watching her. The whispers came again, not loud but sharp. Asterisk, you won't survive without me. Asterisk, asterisk, they'll fall apart. Asterisk, asterisk, you need structure. You need silence. Asterisk. Elena shook her head, jaw clenched. No, she said, her voice steady despite the roar in her ears. We need each other. A small boy in the crowd stepped forward. He couldn't have been more than 10. His hand still held a carved wooden disc, the same circle symbol etched into its face. He looked down at it, then up at Elena, and then, slowly, he let it fall. The disc hit the cobblestone with a tiny clack, almost silent. The figure flinched, not from the sound, but from what it meant. It was unraveling faster now. The woman stood, leaning on Elena for support. Her voice was weak, but clear. It's never needed strength, she whispered. Only belief. That's the root of it. Luca stepped forward beside the child. We don't believe in you anymore, he shouted. And then another voice, an older man, called out, You don't protect us. You control us. One by one, villagers began throwing down the objects they once carried with such care. Stones, tokens, pages, anything tied to the teachings. Each impact rang louder than it should have, echoing like truth through the square. Clack, snap, thud, and with every object dropped, the figure shrank just a little. It tried again, reaching out a long, flickering limb as if to pull the belief back toward it. The air warped with its desperation. The shadows stretched. The sky flickered again, red fighting against the stars. It was like the last gasp of something ancient and hollow. Then Rurik stepped forward. His expression was hollow at first, dazed and unsure, but something in him flickered awake. He looked at the stone in his hand, now just cold gray rock, and he let it go. It hit the ground and cracked open. The figure roared, not in sound, but in pressure. The air squeezed. The wind howled. Trees bent. Windows burst outward in nearby houses. It lashed out in every direction, desperate to remain. The red light flared so bright it blinded everyone for a moment, a final surge of control trying to force itself back into the minds of the crowd. People staggered. Some fell to their knees, but they didn't bow, and Elena didn't flinch. She stood tall and raised her voice once more, even as the pressure pushed against her chest. We don't belong to you, she cried. We belong to each other. The last words struck like lightning. And then, in one shared moment, the villagers screamed, not in fear, but in refusal. The collective sound of dozens of people shouting, shook the air like thunder. And the figure shattered. It didn't collapse or fade. It broke, like glass under a hammer. Its shape exploded into shards of red smoke, dissolving into the night sky, sucked upward like dust caught in a vacuum. The pressure vanished. The ground settled. The torches returned to normal flame. The night finally was quiet. Not the silence that hides fear, but the kind that follows relief. Elena dropped to her knees, breath ragged, tears spilling down her cheeks. Luca rushed to her side, holding her tightly, both of them trembling. Not out of fear, out of release. The woman, still standing, barely, closed her eyes, and whispered, "It's over." But Elena shook her head. "No, it's only beginning." She looked around the square. People were hugging, crying. Some stood in stunned stillness, not yet sure what to do with freedom after so long under the weight of something they didn't even realize they had submitted to. She turned to Rurik, who looked more fragile now than she'd ever seen him. He met her eyes. "I don't know who I am without it," he admitted softly. "You're not alone," Elena replied. "None of us are. That's the whole point." He nodded slowly. "We'll need to talk, to share what happened." "We will," she said, out loud, "so it can't happen again." From behind them, someone had started lighting new lanterns, not with red fire, but with soft golden flames. The houses looked warm again, like homes, not cells. The town felt different. And then someone started humming. A low, gentle tune, wordless but familiar. Others joined. The sound was human, imperfect, and real. The woman from the house stepped beside Elena, her voice quiet. "You took a risk." Elena looked at her. "You were the one who walked away first." "Yes," she said, "but you reminded them how to follow." Luca looked up. "Will it come back?" The woman paused. "It always tries," she said. "That kind of power, it doesn't die. It waits, finds cracks in fear. It doesn't need to be a monster. Sometimes, it's just a whisper in a meeting. A quiet rule no one questions. A punishment for speaking up." "Then how do we stop it?" he asked. "By remembering," she replied, "and reminding others. Every day." Elena placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's what we'll do." The stars above glowed brighter now, no longer hidden by false light. The breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and earth, not fear. The village felt awake for the first time in generations. And though the story was not over, though there would be more days ahead filled with questions and rebuilding, it was clear. The cruelest legacy of the past wasn't just the pain people caused each other. It was the silence they wrapped around that pain, calling it peace. But tonight, silence had lost its voice. And tomorrow, the truth would speak. As the village settled into its first real quiet in generations, Elena stood under the starlit sky, feeling the weight of everything they'd just been through slowly lift from her shoulders. People were beginning to move again, not like they were controlled, not like they were being watched, but like they had remembered how to move for themselves. There was something deeply human in it. The fear had broken. The red lights were gone. The whispers had stopped. But Elena knew that peace wasn't permanent. It was something you had to hold on to moment by moment. Luca walked beside her, still quiet but no longer afraid. The villagers had started to speak in full voices again. Rurik had gone back into his home with the help of 2 older men. And the woman from the house, the one who had once carried all the blame for this, sat near the chapel steps, her hands folded, her eyes soft. Everything seemed to be closing in the right way. The circle broken, the influence shattered, and the people freed. But deep in her chest, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something hadn't quite ended. Something still lingered in the air. Not evil, not visible, but unresolved. Like the final page of a book hadn't been turned yet. Then a flicker. She noticed it first as a faint warmth in her palm. She glanced down and froze. The stone, the same one that had cracked open near Rurik. It was somehow in her hand again. Only now it wasn't glowing. It was humming. Not with power, but memory. Her heart skipped. She hadn't picked it up. She was sure of that. But here it was, whole, smooth, etched with the same circle. This time, though, there was a second line inside the circle, a break in the symbol. A fracture. She looked around. Everyone else was too busy celebrating. No one noticed. She walked slowly away from the crowd, toward the edge of the woods where the trees still stood tall and silent. There, where the wind was cooler and the night was darker, she held the stone to her ear. A whisper tickled her mind, not like before, not controlling. Just a voice. "You saw the monster," it said gently, "but you haven't seen the architect." Elena's throat tightened. "I thought it was over," she said out loud. "It is. For them," the voice replied. "But not for you." She turned the stone in her fingers, her mind spinning. "Why me?" "Because you didn't destroy it," the voice said. "You became the only one who could shape what comes next." Suddenly, Memories began flooding back, not just of the house, or the teachings, or the figure in the square, but of moments from earlier in her life. The dreams she used to have, the odd symbols she used to draw as a child, the feeling that something old was always waiting for her to return to it. She had thought it was just curiosity, but now she understood. The woman from the house hadn't chosen her randomly. She had been part of this from the beginning. And the belief, the silence, the influence, it wasn't a single curse to be broken. It was a pattern, a loop that reset itself, waiting for a new voice to wear a different face. You can reshape the truth, the whisper said. You can write the new version of peace. Elena felt sick. I don't want it, she whispered. But you're already holding it, the voice replied. She looked down at the stone again. The fracture was gone. It was whole. Power hummed beneath the surface, soft but undeniable. She could feel it offering her something. Not command, not control, but influence. A chance to rebuild things her way. Gently, quietly. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, that's how it starts. But maybe your version will be different, the voice offered sweetly. She nearly dropped it. And then she remembered what the woman had said earlier. Asterisk. It's not the teachings that are dangerous. It's the silence we protect them with. Asterisk. She clenched her fist around the stone and stared into the forest. The sky above her was still lit with stars, but now they felt colder, farther away. Behind her, the village was still cheering. They believed it was over. Maybe it was. For them. But as Elena slipped the stone into her coat pocket, she knew the real test wasn't whether the monster had been destroyed. It was whether the next voice would choose silence. Or truth. And deep inside, she wasn't sure which one she would choose yet. The wind moved through the trees, gently now, rustling the branches like an old lullaby. Elena stood still, her hand in her coat pocket, fingers wrapped around the smooth, pulsing stone. It was so quiet out here. No voices, no fires, no more pressure pushing down on her chest. But the stillness didn't calm her. It only made her more aware of what she carried. She thought about going back to the square, to Luca, to the villagers who now laughed and whispered freely like children learning to speak again. But part of her didn't want to go back. Not yet. The stone felt warm against her palm, almost like it had a heartbeat of its own. It didn't speak anymore, not directly, but she could still feel it. The suggestion, the invitation. Elena sat down on a low rock, staring into the trees as her mind raced. She had believed, once, that the cruelest people in history were the ones who ruled with iron fists and sharp blades. But she was starting to understand that cruelty wasn't always loud. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it smiled. Sometimes it offered safety so gently you didn't even notice the bars being built around you. That was what the woman had tried to show her. And now, the decision rested with her. She pulled the stone from her pocket and turned it over in her hand. It looked ordinary again, just a weathered bit of gray with a faint symbol carved deep into it. Nothing glowing, nothing magical. And yet, the power hadn't left. It had simply quieted, waiting. A branch snapped behind her, and she turned quickly. Lucas stepped into view. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching her. In his eyes, there was concern, but also understanding. I figured you'd be here, he said softly. Elena nodded. I needed space. He stepped closer, sat beside her. Is it still with you? She didn't answer at first. She held up the stone so he could see it. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Luca looked at the stone, then at her. You could throw it away. I did, she said. It came back. He thought about that for a while, then said, maybe it doesn't want to leave you because you're the only one who didn't want to use it. Elena smiled faintly. Maybe. Luca looked up at the stars. Do you think she knew this would happen? The woman in the house? He nodded. I think she hoped it wouldn't, Elena said. But I think she always knew it could. The sky was darker now. The stars had moved slightly, and the air had cooled. But the forest didn't feel threatening anymore. It just felt old, like it had seen all of this before. Maybe it had. Maybe there had always been someone, somewhere, holding the power to shape belief and wondering whether to use it. Elena turned to Luca. Do you think people need leaders? He tilted his head. I think people need each other. Sometimes that means someone speaks louder. But that doesn't make them right. It just makes them heard. She nodded slowly. He looked at her again. Are you scared? Yes. Good, he said. You should be. And then he smiled. They sat there a while longer, not saying much, just breathing in the cool night air. Elena thought about the villagers, about Rurik, about all the ones who had followed without questioning. Not because they were weak, but because they trusted, because they were afraid to be alone in their thoughts. It was easy to see how influence could become control. It was harder to admit how much people sometimes wanted to be controlled. The stone still rested in her hand, heavier than it looked. She closed her fingers around it again. I think I have to go, she said. Luca's brow furrowed. Where? I don't know yet, she replied. But this isn't just about one village, or one group of people. This kind of silence, this fear, it spreads. He looked down. You think it's still out there? She nodded. Not as a shadow, not as a voice, but as an idea, waiting to be believed again. Luca didn't argue. He just looked sad. You'll come back, he asked. I hope so, she said. But if I don't, you'll remember? He nodded slowly. I won't let them forget. She stood, brushing the dust off her coat. The forest path stretched ahead of her, empty and quiet, but open. Not waiting, not inviting. Just there. Luca watched her go. He didn't follow. He didn't need to, because this part of the story wasn't his. And as Elena walked, the stone in her pocket pulsed again. Once, then went still. She didn't throw it away. Not yet, because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't power. It was pretending you didn't have it. Elena moved through the forest with slow, careful steps. The moon hung low over the treetops, painting silver lines across the path ahead. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew this was the kind of choice that had to be made by facing forward. Leaves crunched underfoot, but otherwise the world had fallen quiet again. Not the oppressive silence from before. This was different, honest, breathing. She kept her hand inside her coat pocket, the stone resting in her palm like a steady, quiet weight. No whispers came now, no strange visions or promises. Just warmth, like a sleeping ember, not dead, just waiting. Her thoughts drifted to Luca's voice, to the villagers, free but uncertain, to the woman from the house, who had once been misunderstood by everyone, including Elena. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this story had never been about stopping something evil. It had always been about recognizing the difference between guidance and control, between comfort and truth. By the time the trees opened up, the sky was already turning gray with the first signs of morning. She stood at the edge of a low hill, looking out across the land. Below her was another village, smaller, quieter. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and there was a stillness there that reminded her too much of where she'd just come from. But it wasn't just about that village. She knew now this thing they'd fought wasn't born in one place. It lived wherever people gave up their voices for the illusion of peace, wherever leaders promised safety in exchange for silence, and wherever the teachings of those who once warned against control were twisted into tools for it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the stone again. This time, she really looked at it. The surface was worn smooth, but the symbol, once sharp and complete, was now cracked through the center. A small fracture ran across the loop, splitting it just enough to break the illusion of perfection. The power was still in it, yes, but it was no longer untouchable, no longer unquestioned. And then something shifted. The stone warmed quickly in her hand, and for a brief second, she felt the air around her go still again. Not threatening, not heavy, but focused, like time had narrowed its gaze on her. She turned her head slightly and saw a man watching her from a distance. He stood by the edge of the field, his cloak long, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't wave, just waited. Elena squinted against the early light, trying to see more clearly, but there was something off about him. Not menacing, not yet, but familiar, like she'd seen him before. Then he turned and began walking down the path toward the village. Elena hesitated. Every instinct in her told her to walk away, to go in the opposite direction, to toss the stone, to find Luca again, to start over somewhere far from all of this. But she didn't move, because something deep inside her was shifting too. Maybe the cruelest people in medieval history weren't always the ones with swords and armies. Maybe the most dangerous ones were those who truly believed they were doing good while quietly building systems that hurt others. Systems that lasted long after they were gone. Systems that taught generations to obey without asking why. And maybe that man walking ahead of her believed he was doing good too. She didn't know who he was. Not yet, but she knew what had to be done. She slipped the stone back in her pocket, took a breath, and followed. The trail wound down into the valley, and as she moved, the birds began to stir overhead. The quiet songs of morning filled the trees. The world was waking up, and so was something inside her. Each step felt heavier now, not with fear, but with purpose. She reached the edge of a new village just as a group of children ran past, chasing a ball made from bundled rags. They didn't look at her with suspicion or reverence, just curiosity. She smiled softly. That was a good sign. An older woman nodded at her from a doorway. A man adjusted a wooden cart in the street. Life here felt normal, peaceful, but Elena had learned that peace could be deceiving. She glanced around for the man in the cloak, but he had vanished. Still, she knew he hadn't gone far. She found a bench in the center of the square and sat, watching the people move through their morning routines. Her hand rested over the stone again. It didn't pulse this time. It just waited with her. It was strange, she thought, how easily belief could become control, how a symbol could carry so much weight, and how quickly people forgot to question what they'd been told, especially when those telling them did so in soft voices and kind eyes. A small boy approached her, his face sticky from honey, his hands gripping a wooden toy. "Are you the new teacher?" he asked. Elena blinked. "What?" "The one the mayor said would come," he said. "Someone to help us understand the old ways again." Her chest tightened. "I don't know," she said honestly. He smiled anyway. "You look like a teacher." He ran off again. Elena stared ahead. The mayor. So they were expecting someone. She reached in her coat and took out the stone one more time. It glinted in the light. She remembered what Lucas said. "You're the only one who didn't want to use it." But the world didn't need another person carrying quiet influence. It needed someone to break the cycle completely. She stood up, walked to the edge of the square, and without a word, she dropped the stone into the village's well. The sound of it hitting the water was faint, but real. She didn't look back this time. She simply kept walking, down the next road, toward the next unknown. Because the truth didn't live in symbols. It lived in choices, and Elena had made hers. The road ahead was quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. As Elena moved forward, her steps were lighter, her breath steady, and her heart, while still heavy with all that had happened, finally felt her own. She had left the stone behind, not just as a symbol of power, but as a sign that she had chosen to walk away from control disguised as peace. The weight of it, once lodged in her chest, had disappeared into the well like a final chapter closed with purpose. She didn't look back, not because there was nothing worth remembering, but because she now understood that memory and forward motion could live together. The villagers she left behind had started healing. Rurik, quiet and reflective, had begun helping rebuild the library they once used to fear. Lucas stayed behind too, not to wait for her return, but to help others rediscover their voices. He'd said he wanted to be the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. Elena knew he would. As she traveled through the countryside, she stopped in places where the signs were faint but familiar. Villages with too many rules and not enough laughter. Schools where questions were met with frowns. Meetings held behind closed doors where ideas weren't debated, just handed down like unchangeable truths. It was always quiet in those places. Too quiet. But Elena didn't bring fire. She didn't bring warnings or speeches. She brought questions. She listened. She told stories. She asked people what they believed, and most importantly, asterisk why star. Sometimes the answers opened doors. Other times they built walls. But little by little, the silence cracked. Not because of anything supernatural, but because the truth had a way of echoing when spoken out loud. There were nights when she thought of the woman from the house, the one who had carried the burden of twisted teachings for so long, only to be erased by her own legacy. Elena sometimes wondered where she was now, if she had finally found peace in a world that kept trying to reshape her. But mostly, she hoped the woman had seen what Elena had done, had seen her choose a different ending. Elena knew she wasn't a hero. She didn't change everything. The world was still filled with people hungry for control and others too afraid to resist. But maybe that wasn't her role. Maybe it was enough to plant doubt in the wrong places and courage in the right ones. Maybe all anyone could do was remind people that they always had a choice, even when it didn't feel like it. Years passed. Seasons turned. Elena became known in stories, though her name often changed. Some called her the girl who walked away from the red lights. Others said she came from a town that disappeared in silence and re-emerged with a heartbeat. But she never stayed long enough to hear her own legend. One spring evening, she returned, quietly, without notice, to the village where it had all begun. The square looked different. Children played openly now, laughing without glancing over their shoulders. The old chapel had been turned into a hall where people met weekly to share stories and lessons, not teachings. Stories, conversations, even arguments. All were welcome. The mayor, a younger woman now, greeted Elena like she already knew who she was. Elena never confirmed it. She didn't need to. She walked past the old well where the stones still rested, deep in the water below. It had never resurfaced. Some had searched for it. Others said it was just a tale. Elena smiled. Let them wonder. Let them ask. That night, she sat under the stars near the edge of the woods. Luca found her there. His hair was grayer now, his eyes a little softer. I knew you'd come back, he said. Elena laughed. You always said that. He handed her a cup of warm tea. They still talk about you. But now, they argue over what you meant. She took a sip, the steam curling between them. Good. That means they're thinking. They sat together for a while, watching the sky. Luca asked, Do you think it's over? Elena didn't answer right away. She looked out over the land, past the quiet homes, past the hills. I don't think it ever really ends, she said. But it changes. And as long as people are willing to speak, really speak, it can't grow the same way again. He nodded. Later, before dawn, she prepared to leave once more. Luca hugged her, tighter than he ever had before. Don't disappear again, he said. I'm not disappearing, she said with a smile. I'm just moving. As she walked back onto the road, the stars began to fade behind the early light of morning. Her bag was lighter this time, her steps more certain. There were still places that needed truth. Not answers, truth. The kind that came with asking hard questions, with listening, with choosing not to be silent, even when it was easier. And somewhere, in a quiet well, the old stone slept. Not gone, not destroyed, just waiting. But as long as people remembered what silence could do, and what speaking up could prevent, it would stay there. Elena walked on, and the world, imperfect and wide and uncertain, moved with her.